You are standing in front of the most famous garden in the ancient world. Terraces climb above your head, stacked one on top of the other, green against a desert sky. Water trickles down through stone channels from somewhere near the top. Trees grow 40 feet in the air, rooted in soil that has no business being that high off the ground. Now, here is the problem. No archaeologist has ever found this place. Not one brick, not one root, not one irrigation channel that can be tied with certainty to a garden built in the city of Babylon. For a wonder so famous that it made it onto nearly every ancient list of the greatest structures on Earth, standing alongside the pyramids of Giza and the lighthouse of Alexandria, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon have left behind almost nothing you can touch. Compare that to the pyramids, which still rise out of the desert today. Exactly where every ancient source says they should be. The gardens have no such anchor, just a location that has never once matched the description. So were they real? Or is one of history's most repeated stories actually a very old case of mistaken identity? To understand how a garden this famous could vanish so completely, you have to go back to the sources. Not modern books, not documentaries, the actual ancient writers who first described it. And here is where things start to get strange, because not one of them ever saw the gardens themselves. The earliest detailed description comes from a writer named Diodorus Siculus, working around the 1st century BCE. That is roughly 400 years after the gardens supposedly existed. Diodorus describes tiered stone terraces, some of them 100 feet high, planted with trees so large their roots had to be housed in layers of reed, bitumen, and lead to keep water from rotting the stone beneath them. Bitumen, if you have not heard the word before, is a thick, tar-like substance the ancient Mesopotamians used the way we use waterproof sealant today. It kept water from soaking through and destroying the structure underneath. Diodorus also gives you dimensions. He claims the terraces stretched roughly 400 feet along each side, rising in stepped platforms that resembled a Greek theater seen from the outside. Each level supported on stone columns strong enough to bear the weight of soil, deep enough to grow full-sized trees. That is not a decorative flower bed. That is a small forest, suspended in the air above a desert city, held up by nothing but engineered stonework. Another writer, a Greek geographer named Strabo, adds more detail a little later, writing sometime around the turn of the millennium. He describes a screw-like device used to lift water from the Euphrates River up through the terraces, floor by floor, so it could pool at the top and trickle back down through the plants below. This detail matters more than it might seem, because lifting water uphill without a mechanical pump is not simple. It requires real engineering, a way to convert human or animal effort into a steady upward flow against gravity. If Strabo's account is accurate, it would place the Babylonians centuries ahead of when this kind of screw device shows up anywhere else in the historical record, since similar water-raising screws are usually associated with the Greek mathematician Archimedes, who lived roughly 300 years later. There is a third ancient source worth knowing about, and his story is almost as strange as the gardens themselves. His name was Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing around 290 BCE, close enough to Babylon's glory days that he should have known the city better than any Greek visitor ever could. Berossus wrote a history of Babylon in Greek, aimed at a Greek-speaking audience, and in it he apparently described the gardens too, crediting them to Nebuchadnezzar and linking them to that same story about a homesick queen from the mountains. The catch is that Berossus's original writing did not survive. Not one full copy exists anywhere in the world today. Everything you know about what Berossus wrote comes from fragments, quotations, copied by much later writers such as the historian Josephus and the churchman Eusebius, centuries after Berossus lived, and more than 200 years after Nebuchadnezzar supposedly built anything at all. So even your earliest Babylonian-adjacent source for the gardens is not really a first-hand account. It is a copy of a copy, filtered through writers who had their own reasons for retelling the story. Here is your first question. If the gardens were genuinely that impressive, why does the man who wrote the single most detailed eyewitness account of ancient Babylon never mention them at all? That man was Herodotus, a Greek historian writing around 450 BCE, roughly a century closer to the supposed construction of the gardens than Diodorus or Strabo. Herodotus visited Babylon in person, walked its streets, and wrote pages about the city afterward. He described its walls, said to be wide enough for a chariot to turn around on top of them. He described its temples, its river, its customs, in extraordinary and often exaggerated detail. And he said nothing about a garden hanging in the air above the city streets. For a wonder later ranked alongside the pyramids of Giza, that silence is loud. So who actually built the hanging gardens, according to the stories that do exist? The most common version credits King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon in the 6th century BCE. The legend says he built the gardens for his wife, a woman from the mountainous region of Media, to ease her homesickness for the green hills of her homeland in the middle of Babylon's flat, dry plain. It is a romantic story, a king moving mountains, literally, to comfort someone he loved. It is also a story with a problem. The Babylonian records from Nebuchadnezzar's own reign are unusually thorough. Babylonian kings were not shy about listing their accomplishments. Building projects were carved into stone, recorded on clay tablets, celebrated in inscriptions meant to last forever. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions describe his palace. They describe the famous Ishtar Gate, covered in glazed blue brick and golden dragons and bulls, which archaeologists actually did find, and which you can see reconstructed today in a museum in Berlin. They describe his renovations to temples across the city. They do not describe a garden. This brings you to a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey, who spent nearly 2 decades from 1899 to 1917 excavating the real ruins of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. Koldewey uncovered the Ishtar Gate. He uncovered the massive city walls that ancient writers had described. He uncovered temple foundations, palace structures, and administrative buildings, layer by layer, following the physical evidence the way modern archaeology demands. In one part of the site, near the northeastern corner of the palace complex, Koldewey found a structure with unusually thick walls, over a dozen small chambers, a strange vaulted basement, and what appeared to be a deep well shaft with 3 separate openings arranged side by side, unlike anything else uncovered anywhere in the city. It reminded him instantly of the ancient descriptions of the gardens, particularly the layered irrigation system Diodorus had described centuries earlier. He proposed, with real confidence, that this was it. The physical remains of the hanging gardens, finally located in the ground after 2,000 years of speculation, guesswork, and legend. For a while, that theory held, and it made its way into textbooks and encyclopedias as though the case were closed. But it never quite fit, and the more closely later archaeologists examined it, the more the problems multiplied. The location Koldewey identified sits well within the old city, hundreds of yards from the Euphrates riverbank, which every ancient source insists the gardens sat directly beside, precisely so water could be drawn up from the river itself. A garden built that far from its water source would defeat the entire purpose of the irrigation system the ancient writers described in such detail. And cuneiform tablets, the wedge-shaped writing pressed into wet clay that the Babylonians used for record-keeping, tax collection, and inventory, were later found associated with that exact structure. When scholars translated them, the tablets identified the building plainly, in the Babylonians' own words, as a storage facility for grain and administrative goods, not a garden, a warehouse. So if Koldewey's discovery was not the answer, where does that leave you? This is where a modern historian enters the story, and where the mystery takes its most interesting turn. Stephanie Dalley, an Assyriologist at Oxford University, who has spent decades translating cuneiform texts, spent years chasing a theory that sounds almost too simple once you hear it. What if everyone had been looking in the wrong city? Dalley's research points not to Babylon, but to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, located roughly 300 miles north along the Tigris River. And the king she points to is not Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon at all. It is Sennacherib, king of Assyria, who ruled Nineveh about a century earlier, around 700 BCE. Here is why that matters. Sennacherib left behind inscriptions describing a garden he built beside his palace, watered by an enormous engineering project, a system of canals and aqueducts stretching over 30 miles to bring water from mountain streams into the city, and a bronze water-raising device that some scholars believe may be the same kind of screw mechanism Strabo later described in his account of the Hanging Gardens. Centuries afterward, only misattributed to the wrong city and the wrong king. Sennacherib's own inscriptions describe planting exotic trees and unfamiliar plants gathered from distant lands, arranging them on raised terraces built to imitate a natural mountain landscape, a deliberate echo of the green hills far from the flat plains around his city. Sound familiar? It is almost the exact same story later told about Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian queen and her homesickness for the mountains just centuries earlier and in a different place. There is one more piece of evidence that makes Dalley's theory even more compelling, and it is the kind of evidence historians usually only dream about. Archaeologists working at Nineveh have uncovered stone relief carvings, images carved directly into palace walls by artists working under Sennacherib's own patronage, that depict something remarkably close to the later Greek descriptions. Terraced gardens supported by rows of stone columns. Water flowing down through multiple levels, channel by channel, exactly the mechanism Diodorus and Strabo would describe centuries later, thousands of miles away, in a language the original artists never spoke. Trees rising above a walled city, arranged deliberately to be visible from a distance, as though the entire point of the garden was to be seen and admired, not hidden away. These carvings date to Sennacherib's reign, and they exist right now, today, in museum collections. You can see them. They are not a reconstruction based on legend, sketched centuries later by someone trying to imagine what the old stories might have looked like. They are contemporary evidence, carved in stone by people who were alive at the same time as the garden they show, working from direct observation rather than rumor. In archaeology, that gap between an object and the event it depicts matters enormously. A carving made during a king's own lifetime by artists working in his own palace carries a different kind of weight than a description written 400 years after the fact by a foreign visitor who never set foot in the city. Compare that to Babylon, where after more than a century of careful, methodical digging, following every clue in every ancient text, nothing comparable has ever turned up. No relief, no inscription, no irrigation system tied conclusively to a garden, just one misidentified warehouse and 2,000 years of borrowed reputation. So let's reconstruct the scene properly. Not Babylon, with its flat mud brick walls stretching along the slow bend of the Euphrates, but Nineveh, a city built on higher, rockier ground beside the faster-moving Tigris. Its palace walls carved with images of a garden climbing upward in stone terraces above the rooftops of the city. Picture the aqueduct itself first, since without it, nothing else works. Ancient engineers, working with nothing but bronze tools, ropes, and enormous manpower, cut a channel more than 30 miles long through hills and across valleys, carrying water from distant mountain springs down toward the capital. In places, the channel had to cross a low valley, so the builders constructed a stone bridge to carry the water above the ground, an aqueduct in the truest sense. Centuries before Rome became famous for building exactly this kind of structure. Picture the plants next. Not native desert scrub, but unfamiliar species gathered deliberately from military campaigns and foreign trade routes stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the edges of Egypt, carried back to Nineveh, specifically to be planted where the king could see them from his palace windows. Cedar trees, vines, unusual flowering shrubs nobody in the city had ever grown before, arranged deliberately to recreate a mountain landscape the king remembered, or perhaps simply admired from somewhere far from his flat, dry capital. And picture the device that made all of it possible. A bronze mechanism, turning slowly, worked by hand or by animal power, lifting river water upward against gravity itself, one twist at a time, so that trees rooted far above the natural ground level could stay alive in a climate that should never have been able to support them. It is not a passive garden. It is a machine wrapped around a garden. Engineering disguised as beauty. That is a garden built by an engineer's obsession, not just a king's romantic gesture. And it is sitting in the wrong city in almost every book, every documentary, every list of ancient wonders you have ever seen. Here is your counterintuitive twist. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, quite possibly, may never have existed in Babylon at all. What may have actually happened is a kind of ancient game of telephone, played across centuries and languages instead of a single afternoon. Greek writers, working centuries after the fact, relying on second-hand accounts and travelers' tales rather than first-hand records or direct translation of Assyrian and Babylonian texts, may have simply confused two of Mesopotamia's most powerful and most similar-sounding empires. To a Greek visitor centuries removed from either kingdom, Assyria and Babylon likely blurred together into a single distant, exotic idea of Mesopotamian power. The way a modern traveler might casually blur details between two neighboring countries they only know through secondhand stories. Babylon was the name that stuck in later memory, and there is a fairly simple reason why. Babylon remained famous and legendary long after Nineveh had been destroyed and largely forgotten. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, attacked by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, and sacked so thoroughly that the city was left in ruins, its palaces burned, its name fading from common knowledge for centuries afterward. When later travelers passed through the region, there was often little left standing to remind them that Nineveh had ever been an empire's capital at all. Babylon, meanwhile, continued to loom large in the ancient imagination for hundreds of years after its own decline, appearing again and again in religious texts, in later Greek and Roman histories, in stories that outlasted the empire itself by a very wide margin. If a legendary garden needed a famous city to attach itself to, decades or centuries after the actual builder's name had faded from memory, Babylon was simply the more available, more recognizable option. If a garden really did exist, and the physical evidence at Nineveh suggests something remarkable really was built there, its legend may have simply drifted, decade after decade, story after story, attaching itself to the more famous name. Not a hoax, exactly. Something closer to a case of mistaken identity that ran for 2,000 years, repeated so often by so many respected ancient writers that almost nobody thought to question it. That should make you a little uneasy, and here is why. Think about how certain you probably were, before this video, that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were simply a fact of history, sitting comfortably next to the pyramids of Giza on every list of ancient wonders you were ever shown. You likely never questioned it. Why would you? It appeared in textbooks, it appeared in documentaries, it appeared in casual conversation as though it were as solid as the pyramids themselves, which, unlike the gardens, you actually can walk up and touch today. But the gardens survived not because of stone or brick, the way the pyramids did. They survived because they were repeated. Writer copied writer, generation copied generation. And somewhere in that long chain of retelling, the details solidified into something that felt like settled fact, even though the physical evidence never caught up to match it. A story told with enough confidence, by enough respected voices, in enough different centuries, starts to behave like proof, even when proof is exactly what it is missing. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not just an ancient problem. You do this too. Right now, today, you almost certainly believe things you have never personally verified, simply because you heard them enough times from people who sounded confident, who seemed to know what they were talking about. A historical fact, a scientific claim, a piece of trivia about your own body, a story about your own family passed down so many times nobody remembers where it started. Somewhere along the way, repetition did the work that evidence was supposed to do. Ask yourself how many things you know for certain, the way you were certain the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon, that you have actually traced back to a real source. Not many, probably. Most of what you carry around as fact arrived the same way the gardens did, secondhand, retold, polished, smoothed by repetition until the rough edges of uncertainty disappeared entirely. Somewhere between the original event and the version living in your head right now, there was almost certainly a Diodorus. Someone writing 400 years after the fact, filling in gaps with the most satisfying version of the story, rather than the most accurate one. Because satisfying stories travel further than accurate ones ever do. That is not a flaw unique to you. It is how human memory has always worked, going back to the earliest storytellers who sat around fires and passed knowledge from one generation to the next, long before anyone wrote anything down. Stories survive not because they are accurate, but because they are memorable, because they get retold, because they attach themselves to a name people already recognize. Nineveh was destroyed and forgotten, so its garden, however real, had nowhere to attach itself once the city's own name faded from common memory. Babylon was famous and remembered, its walls still standing in ruins that later travelers could visit, its name appearing again and again in religious texts read across the ancient world. The story went where the fame was, not necessarily where the truth was, the same way a rumor today attaches itself to whichever name is already trending, regardless of who actually said or did the thing in question. Think about how often that still happens now, in your own life. A version of an event gets told once, slightly wrong, maybe simplified for the sake of a better story. And then it gets repeated by someone who trusted the first person completely. Then it gets repeated again. By the 10th retelling, nobody questions it anymore, because questioning something that everyone already agrees on feels almost rude. It feels like doubting the room. But an entire room agreeing on something has never been evidence that the something is true. It is only evidence that the story was good enough to survive being told. So the next time you hear a fact stated with total confidence, whether it is about ancient history, about nutrition, about your own habits, about anything at all that you have simply absorbed because you heard it enough times, it is worth pausing for one extra second. Not to become cynical about everything you know, and not to distrust every person who tells you something. Just to ask the same question historians like Stephanie Dalley spent years asking about a garden that made it onto nearly every list of ancient wonders without a single verified brick to its name. Where did this story actually come from? And has anyone ever gone back to check? Most of the time, you will not have the luxury of an archaeologist digging through 30 feet of desert sand to answer that question for you. Most of the time, the honest answer will simply be that you do not know for certain, and that is a harder thing to sit with than false confidence ever is. But it is also more honest, and honesty about what you actually know versus what you have simply heard often enough to believe is closer to how the Babylonians themselves kept their own records. Carved in stone, pressed into clay, meant to outlast the person who wrote it, precisely because they knew memory alone could not be trusted to carry the truth forward on its own. Because somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates, between a king who built something extraordinary and a legend that outlived the empire that built it, one of history's most famous wonders may have simply been standing in the wrong city the entire time. And nobody thought to double-check for roughly 2,000 years. You are standing in front of the most famous garden in the ancient world, except now you know something almost everyone else does not. It was probably never in Babylon at all.